All right, I know you may not know where I'm referring to when I say this book goes there, but just trust me when I say this book goes there. Have you ever read Lolita and thought, you know what that book needs? None of the subtlety and a shit ton more graphic sexual abuse? Well, if you have, then have I got the book for you, and that would be The End of Alice by A.M. Holmes. So, this book has quite the reputation. It was published, I believe, in like 1996 or 1997, late 90s, and it quite rapidly gained a certain level of notoriety for being a very nasty book. And I think that notoriety has only increased in the years since its publication, so that now it's almost kind of like a legendarily nasty book. Again, this book is a book with a reputation. Is often described as incredibly perverted and depraved and just all around sordid reading material. And with that reputation, it was only a matter of time before I just had to read it. But I did not know really how I was going to respond to it, because even though I was, kind of morbidly curious to read this book just to see how bad it could get, I'm really not all that inclined to lend a great deal of respect to books whose describing adjectives are most often and foremost extreme. I have no problem with books being grotesque or graphic if the story actually warrants it, if it actually justifies going there. But if you're only writing a book to be nasty and to be, just to be depraved and kind of indulge in some really heinous writing, if that's your only goal in writing a book, then I don't really think you've accomplished all that much. So even though I was curious, like I say, to read this book, didn't really know how I was going to react to it. And you know what? My reaction to this book was quite surprising, even to myself. I really did not anticipate feeling towards this book how I ended up feeling. But we're going to talk about that. So, what is The End of Alice about, if you do not know? Well, The End of Alice is presented, I guess it's an epistolary work. I think it's presented as like the written document of an imprisoned pedophile whose name is never given. He's only referred to once in the book, I think, as Chappie. By the way, that is the greatest name for a pedophile probably I've ever heard. Chappie. But anyway, Chappie is an old man who has been in prison for over 2 decades for something he did involving a young girl, and we don't know what that something is until literally like the last page of the book. We don't know what it is. But anyway, he's in prison because he's a pedophile. And he's an old man now. But one day, out of the blue, he gets a letter from a young woman who I believe is like 19. And she is herself something of a hebephile. She has set her sights on a young boy in the neighborhood of, I think, like 12 years of age. She wants to seduce him and kind of corrupt him. And so she's writing to Chappie in prison because I guess she thinks they're kind of like kindred spirits, and she wants to kind of like, just have someone to confide in who will possibly understand what she's doing. So she's writing to Chappie, and he, in return, is kind of living vicariously through her exploits, which she describes in her letters to him, in which he describes to us as the reader. But it is very important that we don't actually get the letters that the girl, because I don't think her name is ever mentioned either. We don't get her letters. We only get Chappie's reconstructions of her letters, and that is a very important distinction, because The End of Alice has it is one of the best examples of the unreliable narrator that I think I've ever read, because there is so much in this book that you don't know whether it's actually happening or whether it's just complete bullshit. Although you kind of lean towards the bullshit because what this book describes is so absurdly, ridiculously over the top in its depravity that you kind of can't really lend it any serious credence, but it really does typify the unreliable narrator quite well, I think. So the writing in this book, it is very obvious that this book is inspired by Lolita because it is written in a decidedly Lolita-esque fashion. Chappie, our narrator pedophile, is he writes in such a grandiose and at times overly verbose style that makes it pretty clear that he's a pretty intelligent, well-educated guy. And he often gets mad at the girl writing him the letters because she's so like not very literarily gifted in her writing. But the voice with which this book is narrated is very reminiscent of Humbert from Lolita, although without any, again, of the subtlety of that book, because what Lolita only implies or describes in an artful, nuanced kind of way, this book just flat out, just in the most coarse, vulgar language possible. As I said, this book goes there, and it really was kind of shocking just how far it went at times. This book, I think, lives up to its reputation because sometimes when you're reading books that have such a hype behind them, oftentimes they don't live up to the hype, and you'll find that the hype exceeds the actual experience. Not so with this book. This book definitely lived up to the hype, being remarkably sordid and all out perverted. And it's not artful at all in its descriptions, but it's still really well written, honestly. The writing in The End of Alice is uh, really good. A.M. Holmes is obviously a pretty good writer. There's a great command of craft on display in this book. But now, let's talk about the characters in this book because we really only have two, which is Chappie, our narrator, the incarcerated child molester, and as we eventually learn, child murderer, and then the nameless girl who is kind of going down the same path. And the narrator, at least, and as I have said before, in a first-person book, the narrator is really the only truly important character that has to be fully rounded, and he definitely is. He is a very memorable character, and this book teases out a lot of stuff regarding his backstory and like his upbringing, which involves some even more insanely depraved sexual abuse that he was subjected to at the hands of his mother, who was like insane, kind of. And of course, it goes there all the way. I can't even describe what this book describes because I'm pretty sure this video would probably get taken down. But it is as shocking as you might imagine it to be. But his character is pretty well fleshed out, and towards the end of the book, especially, we get some more layers to him, and that is a big uh, thing that I noted about this book is that for about the first half, or maybe even the first two-thirds of the book, um, it reads in one tone, and then as you get closer and closer towards the end, the tone gradually kind of changed, or at least it did to me. So to explain my reactions to this book, how I responded to reading it, maybe I'm just a sick bastard, but my reaction to this book was not what most people probably would be, because most people who describe this book, like on Goodreads, you can read the reviews of it, describing it as horrifying, just incredibly depraved and just perverted, and it definitely is. But I read it honestly as something at least partially as a black comedy, because I'm just going to level with you. I was laughing my ass off reading this book. And you're going to say, but how can you laugh at a book that is about explicit child sexual abuse? Well, read the book and you might just find out, because this book was freaking hilarious at times. And it's not that what's being described isn't horrifying, it definitely is, but rather the way that it's described in this combination, florid, kind of, again, grandiose prose, and yet also using the most base, vulgar, and coarse words to describe it, and at times just how over the top it got. I really was. I was laughing my ass off reading this, and that's not at all to take away from the horror of it, or to belittle the subject matter, or anyone who has actually experienced anything like in this book. Although I don't think anyone has probably experienced like what is in this book. But I really was. I was laughing hysterically at times in this book, because there comes a point where it can't really be taken seriously anymore whenever you're just going for broke in terms of the depravity. It reaches a level eventually where the gravity falls away and what you're left with is levity. And that's what happened with this book. There were so many instances of prison sex, prison rape, even some of the sexual abuse stuff that's described in this outside of the prison setting. It got so over the top, and it was just kind of, you couldn't really take it seriously anymore. But you're consciously kind of horrified, and you're horrified that you're laughing at this material. But it was hilarious. I laughed at this book harder than I've laughed at maybe any other book I've ever read. I mean, I was in hysterics reading this. It's just so over the top. But let's talk about what this book's strengths really are, where this book's strong points really lie. And I said it's very well narrated. The narrator in this book is very memorable, and it teases out information well. But the most striking thing about this is that what we're given is only what the narrator of the book deigns to give us. Now, as I said, this book has probably one of the best unreliable narrators I've ever read. And that's because you never know whether what he's describing is real or not. And you lean towards it not being, because you kind of want to think there's no possible way that this could be real. And that's kind of the point. His reconstructing of what the girl is telling him in her letters is very likely not what the letters actually say. And that's kind of the point of the book, is to get you inside the mind of a predator, of a child molester, of a just a monster of a human being, and to get you inside that mind and get you to kind of experience what it's like to think that way. And what it's like to think that way, at least by this book, is that the mind constantly goes to the dirtiest, most vile places, because the behaviors of the people in this book, which the narrator describes to us, are decidedly questionable. At least they do not behave like any people I've ever met. In fact, this book gets downright surreal at times in its perversity. Like, it's so perverted that it has a dreamlike quality about it, and that only heightens the sense of unreality, of questioning whether what you're reading is actually real or whether it's just the fabrication of this incredibly perverted mind. And I love that, because it kind of kept you on your toes all throughout the reading experience. Now let's talk about the tone of this book, because as I said, for a large portion of this book, I was kind of reading it as like a black comedy, because even though it is, once again, incredibly depraved, the way that the depravity is described is kind of comical, or at least it was to me. But that gives way again close to the end. Once you reach about like the last third of this book, there's kind of a quiet shift in tone, or at least it seemed that way to me, because it gets downright melancholic. Actually, it's towards the end. And again, only on like the last page almost are we actually shown what this guy actually did to land him in prison for over 20 years. And yes, it is shocking, and yes, it is incredibly sordid, and it's just kind of the icing on the cake, the piece de resistance on top of this mound of just complete perversity. But the tone changes, and after about the first two-thirds of the book, I wasn't really laughing anymore. In fact, I was kind of oddly moved. It gets kind of sad towards the end, and you don't really expect that it could. And I think that's probably a testament to this book's, efficacy, is that it does. It makes you feel things, or at least it made me feel things that I wasn't expecting to, that I actually kind of felt sorry on this guy's behalf because, as I said, you get more layers to him as you get towards the end, and you see um, then when he was out in the world, he had like pedophilic tendencies, but as is the case with a lot of people like that, um, they try to fight it, and that leads into a valuable question: can these people really help the way they are? Even though obviously the molestation of children is horrible, but an important question is: can these people really help themselves? Can they help the way that they are? And once they do what they do, what is the best course after that? I mean, obviously, you have to remove them from society, but are they to be punished for something that they may or may not be able to even control? And you see this guy trying to control the dark urges within him. He rents a cabin in the woods, and he kind of has like a strict routine where he's trying to just like get himself under control and not give in to his urges. And that's where he meets the titular Alice in the book, and where he eventually meets his own downfall, um, his own undoing, is when he meets the Alice of this book, because that's when it really kicks it into high gear in terms of the depravity. But you kind of do feel some sympathy for him at that point, because you're like, well, he knows what he is, and he was trying not to give into it, even though he ultimately did. So this book actually does succeed in kind of, like Lolita is such a success of a book because it pulls the reader so deeply into Humbert Humbert's mindset, and you identify with him so strongly, even though you know that you shouldn't, because he's just flat out evil. But still, he's so compelling, and he's so kind of just witty that you can't help but kind of like him. And this book does that. And even though this is obviously an imitation of Lolita, and I'm not saying this is on par with Lolita. I mean, of course, this doesn't come close to that. Neither because it lacks the subtlety and the artfulness or the originality, but also just because Lolita is just a treasure trove of marvelous writing. And this book does have good writing, but not anything close to that. But this book succeeds in that same way, as pulling you into this character's mindset and getting you inside his head and kind of understanding him better. So this book is actually a success, I think. And as I said at the beginning, even though I'm kind of predisposed to dislike books whose main descriptors just seem to be the words extreme or graphic, um, I don't mind it, like I said, if there's a reason for it, if it tries to do something other than just that. And I think this book did. This book is incredibly sordid and perverse and depraved, but it's also more than that. That isn't just the point to it. I don't think it actually did manage to kind of move me in certain ways towards the end, which I really didn't anticipate. And of course, it did make me laugh, and I didn't anticipate that at all. So it's kind of a well-rounded book, actually, in some ways. And I really gotta say, I ended up liking it a whole lot more than I thought I would. And honestly, to rate the end of Alice, I'm gonna give this, I think, an A minus. I think it is that good. This book is horrifying to read. But if you can stomach it, if you've got the stomach to read it, I think you may find yourself enjoying it more than you might think. Although I do want to point out this right here, in case you can't see on here, it says the national bestseller on the front of this book. How a book this, you know, extreme ever became a national bestseller, I don't know. But somehow it did, and this book is a national bestseller, apparently, as it proudly proclaims on the front cover. But if you look in the back of this book, you see that? That is the true mark of a print on demand book. So even though this book was the national bestseller, um, apparently now they don't even bother to print up professionally printed copies of it, and they just it's just a print on demand book now. But you know, whatever. That's just kind of a curiosity, I thought. But yeah, the end of Alice, I'm giving it A minus. This book took me places which I didn't necessarily want to go, but uh, I'm not entirely unhappy that it did. It definitely goes to some dark places. Like I said at the beginning, it goes there, but I think there is a point to it, and honestly, this book really does demonstrate a real command of the craft, which I can't help but admire. So yeah, this is, I think, an A minus book to me. It's a pretty good book. So yeah, The End of Alice by A.M. Holmes. Have you read The End of Alice? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about it here today. And if you haven't read The End of Alice, I'm not going to recommend this book because this is not for everybody. This book is not even for most people. Once again, you hear lots of books being described as extreme or being hyped up as something, you know, really, really nasty. And then a lot of the times you read them and they're not. The hype exceeds the actual experience, but not so with this book. This book, it earns every bit of the hype. It is one of the most depraved things I have ever read. But the overall experience for me was quite positive. So, and as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.